Well, there's no denying it. The world's democracies are in crisis, from deepening inequalities, social injustices, and failure to address global warming. There's a pervasive sentiment that elected politicians no longer serve voters' interests. From places like Russia to Turkey or even Hungary and India, the shortfalls of democratic governments as we know it have even spurred pride in so-called illiberal democracies. But what if a more collaborative, consensual model respecting rule by the people were possible? And could a look back to the very birthplace of democracy hold some answers? Well, for more, Claudia Chwalisz joins me on Perspective. She's the CEO and founder of DemocracyNext, which is a research and action institute working to help shape new institutions for the next democratic paradigm. Claudia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Erin.
So before we get to the terms, for ancient Greeks, elections, which are kind of the foundation of modern democracies, constitute an oligarchy. I'm sure if you ask the vast majority of people who live in democracies today, they won't think of their own systems as oligarchies. So how does that manifest in liberal democracies?
Yeah, indeed. And I would have to say that for myself as well for many years. I also thought of democracy as elections, and it's what's come to be the case. It's even enshrined in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But actually, if we go back to Aristotle and for centuries of political philosophy after that, elections were always considered as a form of constituting an oligarchy, which really just means rule by the few. And democracy rather passed through mass participation or participation through sortition, meaning random selection. So it's only very recently in history, kind of at the turning point of the French and American revolutions and the new constitutions that were created after that, that this kind of manifestation of thinking of democracy as elections started to take form. Not immediately, because even if we look back to those documents, if you look at the American Constitution, for example, the word democracy doesn't appear anywhere. And in fact, the intention was to create a system that was intentionally oligarchic. And so it's only much later with the suffragette movements, with demands for suffrage to spread, did that word democracy start being used to talk about this system. And then today we just talk about democracy to describe everything. But that doesn't actually necessarily make it democratic. And I think in this moment, like you were describing in the introduction, of these widespread sense of crises, it's a moment where we should be questioning our assumptions and being like, hold on a second, do we actually even have democracy?
So what does deliberative democracy mean? How do you define it?
So deliberative democracy means, in the simplest sense, that decision-making should be on the basis of fair and reasonable discussion amongst citizens, weighing evidence, taking decisions by consensus. That legitimacy stems from having that process in place. It's not just about aggregating preferences through voting, which is what we have with our system today.
What are the different forms, then, that deliberative democracy can take? You talked about sortition earlier, but I know you're quite specialized in citizens' assemblies.
Yeah, so today, in contemporary times, I would say the most common form that deliberative democracy takes are citizens' assemblies. So these are the assemblies where people are randomly selected to be broadly representative of a population, of a community, and then they are tasked with solving a really complex, pressing policy problem like climate change, like end of life that just took place here. So actually, maybe to make this a less abstract definition, I'll define it by giving the example of what took place here in France recently. So there were 184 people selected by lot to be broadly representative of the diversity of French society. They were convened over the course of 27 days of deliberation spread out over 4 months to deliberate on this question of should France amend its existing legislation on end-of-life issues? And if so, in what ways? So to be able to do that, they heard from around 60 experts, which also included stakeholders, faith group leaders, philosophers, so experts in that broad kind of way about what do we even mean by knowledge. And then they deliberated with one another to come up with 67 really detailed, concrete recommendations on which they found 92% consensus. And then these were delivered to the government. So I would say that the defining elements of these citizens' assemblies are that people are randomly selected. So in principle, everyone has an equal chance of actually being the one in power, that it's deliberative. So there's time, information, weighing evidence. And then there's an intention to find common ground and consensus.
How do you measure the success of these kinds of efforts? Jury duty comes to mind. I suppose is kind of the most similar form that exists in modern democracy today in several countries that kind of touches upon that, at least in the random selection. And at least in the U.S., I feel like people aren't always necessarily enthusiastic about taking part in jury duty. It's seen as a burden. So how are citizens' assemblies ideally, in an ideal world, different?
Well, they're different because it's kind of like jury duty for policy in some ways. I mean, I take your point that I think today sometimes people see it as a burden. I think that's from a general point of view where today people sometimes are not up to always fulfilling their fuller responsibilities as citizens. It's not just about voting, that we actually have this wider range of responsibilities as well as our rights. But actually, a lot of people also really appreciate jury duty, and it's one of the most fulfilling moments of their civic lives as well. So yeah, and I think it's maybe quite different if you receive an invitation from your president or prime minister or the minister or mayor inviting you to serve on a citizens' assembly that's tackling a really important issue that touches either on constitutional issues, on climate change, on the future of your country, and so on. So it kind of touches on a different kind of civic duty that we have, and we see that a lot of people who maybe not necessarily vote, are not active in traditional politics, end up saying yes and being involved in these assemblies because it's like, oh wow, actually I'm being invited to this thing that will take place over 27 days, but this is then going to go to the government, this will change the law. It's actually a really important thing in people's lives.
In my understanding, these citizens' assemblies have mostly advisory roles for now. How can they be integrated into existing institutions, or is that the goal? Is the goal to integrate these types of systems into the existing democracies that we have, or is it kind of more of an overhaul completely eventually of the system?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I would say that it's where I see today where we're at as some sort of transition period to a next democratic paradigm a bit, as you said earlier as well, and the goal is really to help our overall democratic architecture, if we think of that way, evolve beyond just having our electoral institutions. So what we're seeing is that there are more and more places where political leaders are working to establish a legal basis for these citizens' assemblies to be able to actually work in collaboration with our existing institutions. So it's not this thing that's happening kind of off to the side, but is actually integrated. So to give you an example, the first place in the world that has set up a permanent citizens' assembly is in the German-speaking community of Belgium called Ostbelgien. I was involved actually in this process of designing this back in 2018, 2019. And how it works is that there's the parliament of 25 people, but alongside it, there's also a citizens' council with 24 people. And they have an agenda setting role. It's that citizens' council which is the one that decides what issue should go to a one-off citizens' assembly every single year. And now there's a legal mandate for that citizens' assembly's recommendations to go through a parliamentary committee and to have at least 2 debates and a vote by the parliament. So as you can see, this is a simple explanation of how it works. But just to say, it's not about replacing the parliament. It's about how do we help our democracies evolve in a way that can give citizens genuine power in these deliberative assemblies, which are fundamentally changing how democracy, how politics can work. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, then, do these assemblies remove the need for politicians? What space do they have left to bring change forward if it's put in the hands exclusively of citizens? Well, I think they changed the role of politicians, and I think this is precisely why this is a bit of a transition period, because it's not about replacing, but it is about, what is the changing role? What's the changing relationship? I think many people are perhaps quite legitimately disillusioned with democracy as elections and politics as campaigning and the cycles that happen every 4 years or so. And how do we inject this ability to have some more long-term thinking, to put the public good above re-election needs, and politicians are the ones who, are also leading this change. So I just gave you the example of Ostbelgien. It was the president of the parliament and the president of the government who initiated the conversation, but also the parliament voted unanimously to set up this new institution. So I think there's also a responsibility amongst our elected officials today to be the agents of change and to help our democracies evolve towards a new democratic paradigm.
Do you think that deliberative democracy always produces desirable results? Is it immune to populism? Is it necessarily more progressive? I'm thinking of the example in 2022 in Chile when 62% of the population voted against constitutional reform written by a constituent assembly. I know that assembly was elected, which is a shortfall in and of itself, but is there a risk of a sort of tyranny by the majority in these types of systems?
Well, I think it's actually a precisely interesting example that you mentioned Chile, because I think it highlights the pitfalls of relying on elections and the lack of legitimacy that they can have. Because in that context with Chile, the people that were elected for the Constituent Assembly were elected in a moment in time where it was a hyper-progressive group of people. And in many ways, it was a very, very good thing to a lot of people. But when it came to then having a mandate amongst the wider population in the referendum, there was this huge décalage, disconnect between what the wider public actually wanted in that moment in time. And so actually in these citizens' assemblies where people are randomly selected to be broadly reflective of the population, what we see is that you bring in this diversity of perspectives, and by creating the space and time for people to also really understand the nuance of each other's perspectives, to listen to one another. It doesn't mean people 100% agree with one another at the end of it. That's not the point. I would say it's not even desirable. But you do create the conditions for people to be able to really grapple with that diversity of views, and to be able to say, okay, I still don't agree with you, but I can really understand where you're coming from. And I might not agree, but I can live with this, and so I'll go forward with it. And we saw that even with this assembly on end of life. I watched one of the interviews that took place on one of the French news shows afterwards with the participants, and one of the members who was really against the measures was saying why she voted in favour of them because of this process. So the process engenders legitimacy and matters.
Claudia, certainly give us a lot of fruit for thought. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. That's all we have time for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin.
Time now for a reminder of our top story if you're just joining us.